welcome to Astronomy Toronto, the astronomical news magazine seen monthly on Rogers Cable 10 TV. My name is Michael Watson. I'm a member of the Toronto Centre of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, and I'm your host for this edition of Astronomy Toronto. Well, we are now well into the Christmas shopping season, and those of you who have astronomically minded people on your shopping list may be wondering exactly what to get. We're going to help you tonight. We're going to be talking about telescopes, binoculars, different kinds of astronomical equipment, how to pick them out, and what to buy. And I have in the studio as my guests on the immediate left of your screen, Clive Gibbons, who is assistant manager of the Scope Shop, one of Toronto's leading telescope supply houses. And Clive, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mike.
And on the right of your screen, John Kidner, who is a partner in Perceptor, which is located in Scarborough, and again, one of Toronto's leading telescope supply centers. And John, welcome to Astronomy Toronto.
Thank you, Michael.
I'd like to start by asking both of you the same question. This, of course, was the year of the return of Comet Halley, and throughout the year I had the opportunity of speaking with various telescope manufacturers located in the United States. They said, from their point of view, that telescope sales were never better than in 1986. Clive, what was your experience this year?
We noted a definite increase in sales, especially starting at the end of 1985 and leading right into 1986. We found that people were using the comet as a catalyst to get more interested in astronomy, and they were purchasing telescopes and binoculars in much greater quantities than in years previous.
What can you estimate the increase in the volume of
I'd
sales?
say it was approximately double years previous.
That's a large increase. John, did you have anything like that kind of experience?
Our experience was very much the same as Clive's, Michael. We found that the comet brought out a lot of people who have been thinking about buying a telescope for several years. They've been putting it off for various reasons, but they finally felt that this was the time to take a step.
We're going to be coming back to speak with both of you a little later about the various kinds of telescopes as you've been describing, and in particular the telescopes that we have with us in the studio. But first of all, I'd like to take our audience down to the little town of Yarker, just northwest of Kingston. I recently had the opportunity to visit with Terence Dickinson, who is a well-known Canadian astronomy writer and a telescope enthusiast, to talk about different kinds of telescopes and the telescopes that he has in particular. Terry, we've come down today to talk to you about telescopes, and what I'd like to do is ask you, first of all, if you could just tell us, what is a telescope?
The primary purpose of a telescope is to collect lots of light. Stuff in the sky, in the night sky, is faint. You want to make it bright so that you can see the details in the image. And in order to do that, you have to have a lens or a mirror of sufficient width or diameter to collect enough light to bring an image of astronomical quality to the eye. And there's certain minimum standards. Spy glasses and spy scopes and land viewing spotting scopes really aren't adequate. An astronomical telescope is more than that.
Well, let me ask you about the way telescopes are described. I think we've all seen that in stores, department stores, and catalogs and so on, we've seen the advertisements for 100-power telescopes and 200-power telescopes. Is the power or the magnification of a telescope a useful way for describing or specifying the size of a telescope?
It's a minor component of a bigger picture. Magnification can be changed simply by inserting a different type of eyepiece in the telescope. So you have the flexibility to change it, but small scopes with 200, 300, 400 power, when they're advertised that way, it really means nothing.
And why is that?
It's the quality of the scope and the amount of quality light that you're getting at the point where you look in the telescope. That's the important thing. You can magnify it 400 times and it's just a fuzzball in a little telescope, but in a big high-quality scope you'll get an image viewable at those powers.
So that if you have a small telescope and you use a very high-power eyepiece, what you're saying, I take it, is the image won't be worth looking at, really.
Absolutely not, and you're overpowering it. I like to think of the old cars back in the 1950s and 60s when you go in the showroom, and the first thing that you would do would be to look at the speedometer that would go up to 140 miles an hour, but of course the car would never go that fast. But it was a gimmick that was used at the time, and it's the same thing with the 400, 500 power designations to these telescopes. It just doesn't mean anything. And most telescopes are used in the 50 to 250 range.
So
doesn't matter how
lower
big
powers.
they are. Yeah. Low powers are used almost all the time. So power really is something you have to ignore, except as a tool. It's the optics, the size of the optics that's important.
Well, let me ask you this then. If you don't measure a telescope by the magnification or the power, what is the standard of measurement that you use to describe the size of a telescope?
Basically, it's the diameter of the main optical component, whether it's a lens or a mirror, the width of that, and they range anywhere from 2.5 inches up to 17 or 20 for amateur telescopes. The biggest ones being permanently mounted things. You lose the portability with the big ones, and that's a major component of how big you want to go. But there is that minimum size that is necessary.
I'll ask you about that in a moment, but you have mentioned lenses and you've mentioned mirrors, and that suggests to me that there are different optical designs for telescopes. Perhaps you could describe what those are.
Okay. I guess the most common one, and the one that people think of as a classic telescope, is the refractor, where there's a lens that collects the light and refracts it to a focus.
It bends the light?
It bends the light, and like a magnifying glass does. And in doing that, brings it to a point where a little magnifying eyepiece can be put in and the image can be made suitable for the eye to view it. Then there's the reflector type, where there's a bowl-shaped mirror, very, very shallow bowl-shaped mirror. At the bottom of an open tube, the light comes down the tube, off the mirror, and again is brought to a focus. But before the focus is reached, there's a little mirror at the top of the tube, angled, so that the light then comes off through a hole in the side of the tube for viewing, again with an eyepiece. And the eyepieces interchange, allow different magnifications to be used. Then there's a compound telescope, which has both reflective optics and lenses in it. And once again, the main optical component, the width of the main optical component, is the diameter that you use.
Now, just on that kind of telescope, there's a complicated sounding name for it that our viewers might be interested in knowing when they go into the telescope shops. What's the name that's used for that kind of telescope?
Well, there's a bunch of names, and all of them are hard to remember. A compound telescope is properly called a catadioptric telescope.
Catadioptric, yes. Well, now you've kindly lugged out 3 of your monster telescopes for us to take a look at, so let's wander over and you can maybe describe the different kinds of telescopes by reference to those that you have.
Okay, Michael.
Thank you. So Terry, we have all of these telescopes set up here, and we have 3. Maybe you could just tell us which is which.
This is the reflector. This is the refractor telescope, the lens telescope, and that one is the compound telescope. The Schmidt-Cassegrain is the particular type.
All right, well, let's talk about the reflector first of all. This is an odd-looking telescope.
It sure is. You might think that it's a water tank instead of a telescope, but it has this mount that just goes up and down,
yes,
and back and forth.
Very simple mount.
Very simple to keep the big telescope in a form that you can carry it around. It's got these handles on it. This is about the maximum size of a reflector telescope.
Well, what is the size of this one?
13-inch mirror at the bottom. If you just look down the tube,
well, I can see it down there. I look right down the tube, and then right down at the far end is this big mirror.
Yeah.
And I can see an image, and it's actually curved.
Yeah, the curvature of the mirror is such that the light comes down the tube, because the tube is open, reflects off the mirror, up off the little mirror at the side, and out here to where the focuser is. And the eyepieces that we mentioned before for changing the magnification of the telescope are inserted here, and you view simply like this, and move the telescope by actually grasping it and moving it. This type requires constant recentering of the view, because it's not tracking the stars as some other types of telescopes can.
Is that because of the Earth's rotation?
Sure. Just for the same reason the sun rises and sets, the stars do the same thing and are constantly in motion because of the Earth's rotation. And some telescopes have motors in them to do this, to compensate for it, but this one doesn't.
Now let's go over to the other one,
okay,
if we may. This is the refractor. Now this looks more like the kind of telescope that many of us have seen before, a long tube. Can you describe this one?
This is the classic telescope. It's the spyglass refractor telescope with a lens up at the top.
So the lens is right up
Yep.
here.
Lens is there, and the light is refracted, comes to a focus down here. This little diagonal here is simply a prism that reflects the light up, so that you don't have to bend over to look straight up. You can instead look in like so and focus it.
So you
Here.
observe at the bottom of the tube. with
Bottom
this
of the
one.
tube, right. And whereas the top of the tube with the Newtonian reflector telescope. And I should also mention the all good telescopes have a good size finder scope. This has a 2-inch finder scope that has crosshairs in it, and I use this for a wide field view to center the object I'm looking at, so that it then comes into view here when it's at the center of the
I see.
crosshairs. It's difficult to find things without that.
Now, let me ask you about this. There seems to be a gear and a motor system here.
This is the kind that compensates for the Earth's rotation. This axis here is parallel to the Earth's rotation axis, and by turning the telescope on that axis with this motor and these gears, you compensate for the Earth's rotation, so that in viewing through it, the telescope will track automatically the object you're viewing.
And so that the star will stay centered,
Mhm.
appear to stay centered in the
Sure,
eyepiece?
and with the other type, as we mentioned, it requires constant centering every 30 seconds to a minute. So the convenience of this type of telescope is much greater, but you pay for it in the bulkiness of this
Yes.
mount. And this telescope here, the Schmidt-Cassegrain, also has the equatorial
Let's
mount.
take a look at the Schmidt-Cassegrain then. This is the compound telescope you
Mhm.
were describing.
And its equatorial mount is mounted on a fork. It looks different, but it functions the same way, and it's just different shape because there's a stubby tube instead of a long, thin tube, but it has the same function, has a motor in here to compensate for the Earth's rotation.
I see. Now, looking down this tube, I can see the main mirror is at the bottom here.
Yep.
And what else does it have in it?
Well, there's a lens at the front, so this
Yes,
is
that's right at
that's
the
the
top.
compound part of it, and that lens holds a small mirror at the top, which takes the light reflected off the mirror at the bottom, reflects it down, and you can see a hole.
There's a hole right through the tube.
Yeah, at the
Or
bottom
right through the
here.
mirror, rather,
Right
yes.
through the mirror, and it comes out to the viewing port here. And again, you view through this scope like so. And I think the main advantage, which is clearly obvious with this type of telescope, is you got a lot of telescope in a compact size. 10-inch mirror in a telescope that has about the same, or probably is even more portable than the 5-inch refractor.
Now, let me ask you this. If you want to look and if you're city-bound and you can't get into a good dark sky, and let's say you want to look at the planets and the moon, which of the 3 telescopes here would you recommend?
I would say the refractor or the Schmidt-Cassegrain, but probably planets and bright objects, the refractor clearly has an advantage. The images are much sharper, and with these bigger telescopes you can see fainter things, and if that's what you want to go after, then you need pure aperture, lots of light collecting ability.
So
But-
that, for example, if you can get into a good dark sky away from city lights to look at faint galaxies and so on, you would pick either the reflector or the compound telescope?
I'd take the reflector first and the compound second in those cases. But these telescopes are so popular because they're so compact. And with a 4-inch one, it's just about so big, and can be put in almost a briefcase-sized package. So the compactness of these scopes, I think, is clearly their advantage.
Well, now that we're all experts in different kinds of telescopes, so we're back in the studio with our guests Clive Gibbons and John Kidner. What are the kinds of factors that would influence the kind of advice that you would give to people about different kinds of telescopes and equipment? Perhaps I could start with you, John.
Michael, I hate to mention it first because it's not the most important factor, but the budget of the individual
Of course.
obviously has a factor. There are many telescopes people would like to have, but just perhaps can't afford it at this particular point in time. Portability is another very important factor. If the telescope is going to be mounted more or less permanently in one spot, there's a great range of telescope. A big, heavy, difficult to assemble telescope is not out of the question. But if the telescope is going to be packed away each time the person's finished using it, or if it's going to be taken out into the country or taken on holidays, obviously portability is a very important factor.
Well, just on that point, I suppose that where the individual lives is important. If someone lives on the top floor of a high-rise, they're not going to have a permanent observatory, I guess.
No, someone who's city-bound, they can enjoy the planets and the moon and some of the brighter, what we call deep sky objects, but there's no substitute for getting out into the country and getting the dark skies.
Well, now, let me ask you about that, Clive. You're a noted astrophotographer, and you're very experienced in observing from dark sites and from the city. Does the choice of a dark sky as opposed to the light-polluted skies of the cities have anything to do with what you recommend to people?
Usually it does. If a person is observing from a very dark sky location, they can really take advantage of a large aperture reflector-type telescope or a large Schmidt-Cassegrain and get excellent results viewing or photographing deep sky objects like that. But if they're bound to the city and they can't travel to see the deep sky objects, and they're more or less restricted to seeing the planetary objects, the moon, and even the sun if they view it safely, then a smaller telescope will suffice for that type of viewing, and a refractor or a small reflector will be a good choice in that situation.
I see. Now, you've really both divided telescopes into large aperture and small aperture. Let me ask you, Clive, when you said large aperture, what do you mean by large aperture? How many centimeters or inches of aperture do you mean?
That's kind of a hazy area, but most astronomers consider large aperture a 6 or 8 inch or larger.
I see. And so the small aperture telescopes would be a 4.5 inch telescope, or
that's right,
or something
and smaller than that. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, now we now have in the studio with us a number of different telescopes that we've brought and assembled here tonight, and also some photographs of different telescopes that we're going to be looking at. Perhaps what I'd like to do, and I'll start with John, is ask about this telescope. Maybe I'll start with Clive. We'll talk about this white telescope that we have behind you here.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is this? Is this a refractor, a reflector, or a compound telescope?
That is a refractor, Mike. It's a very traditional type of beginner's telescope. And in fact, I'd say 80 to 90% of all people that are buying a telescope for the first time choose a refractor, mainly because it's an inexpensive telescope. It's not a budget breaker to get in on the hobby. Also, it's quite simple to use, and it also is a very good performer for the brighter objects in the sky, like the planets and the moon, which is what most beginners are interested in seeing at first.
All right, now let me ask you this. If you were to use a telescope such as this, a small refractor, and turn it, for example, on the planet Jupiter, what would you see?
You would see the 4 moons quite clearly if they were positioned in the right position. You could also see a couple of the major cloud features on Jupiter, and if the seeing is very good, you might even glimpse the red spot, but it would have to be very good steady seeing to see that sort of detail.
And by seeing, you mean the steadiness of the atmosphere?
Steadiness of the atmosphere. That's very important.
I see. Now, let me ask you this, the all-important question. What would the approximate cost in Canadian dollars in Toronto of such an instrument be?
Well, it could range anywhere from approximately $150 up to $500 or $600 for a refractor telescope on a more complex equatorial mount for tracking the stars.
And what would you say the minimum amount of money would be that you'd have to spend to get an astronomically useful refractor?
Well, if you're looking at a 60-millimeter refractor,
is that like this telescope?
That is a 60 millimeter. Usually refractors for beginners start off anywhere between 2 and 3 inches of aperture. But for getting a 60 millimeter refractor or a 3-inch refractor on an equatorial mount for tracking the stars, you could be spending anywhere from $300 to $700.
All right. Now let's go to the next telescope. We have a red telescope here behind us, and John, I'm going to ask you about this. This telescope looks decidedly different than the refractor we just looked at. What kind of telescope is this?
This one's a reflector, Michael.
And that means it uses a mirror?
It uses a mirror. The mirror is at the bottom end, and people sometimes find it rather curious that the eyepiece is up at the top end. The mirror, however, it's a curved mirror which gathers and collects the light and focuses it, not unlike the way a lens would. But the light has to then travel back up the length of the tube to a smaller flat mirror that takes the light at a 90-degree angle out to the eyepiece.
Right. And what is the aperture of, or the mirror diameter of this telescope?
On that particular one, it's 4.5 inches.
Now, it looks to me that the mount for this telescope is slightly more complex or complicated than the tripod mount that we had for the refractor.
Yes, the tripod type of mount is often referred to as an alt-azimuth. You're able to move the telescope left and right, up and down, so it can be pointed at any particular position in the sky. But as the star or a planet appears to drift across the sky because of the Earth's motion, it has to be tracked in both axes, left to right and up and down. With an equatorial mount, which is the mount that the red telescope is mounted on, you're able, with proper initial setup, to track an object just in one axis only.
So it's very easy to move and to follow the stars as they move.
Once you're used to the scope, it's a
Yes.
little tricky to get used to at the beginning, but once you have mastered it, it's much easier to follow an object.
I see. All right, now again, the all-important question. What would a setup like this cost approximately in Canadian dollars?
Approximately $400.
All right. And we asked Clive what kind of view, for example, of the planet Jupiter you would get with the small refractor. What kind of view would you get of the planets in a reflector like this?
Well, because you can get a larger aperture for the same amount of money, the image would be considerably brighter because of the larger light-gathering area. Typically, though, a refractor will give a little better performance specifically on the planets. It'll give just a little sharper detail. But the reflector gives a very good imaging on the planets, and because of the larger light-gathering ability, possibly could be more suited for the deep sky objects.
So what you're saying is that dollar for dollar, you can get a larger aperture with a reflector than with a
Yes.
refractor?
Yes.
And that means a brighter image?
Yes.
I see. All right, we've got the two telescopes behind us. Now we've got a couple of instruments here on the table in front of us. Perhaps Clive will just get you to pick up those hefty-looking binoculars. And let me ask you this. Are binoculars considered an astronomical instrument?
Yes, they are, Mike, and quite often they're an overlooked instrument. Most people get the idea that a telescope is what you need to get started into astronomy, but actually a good pair of binoculars, and this particular pair is an extremely large pair, is a good choice for getting to know the stars and getting to know deep sky objects. You can pick out a surprising number of deep sky objects using a good pair of binoculars, usually a 7 by 50 or a 10 by 50 pair of binoculars. And when I say 7 by 50, I mean 7 power with a 50-millimeter lens. That's an excellent choice.
Let me just stop you there. We've all heard of binoculars, and they have two numbers for the specifications. The first number, then, is magnification?
First number is the magnification, and the second number refers to the size of the front lens, the objective lens on the front of the binocular, and that determines how much light the binocular gathers. So generally, the bigger the front lens, the brighter the image will be looking through the binocular.
I see. So that a 7 by 50 pair of binoculars would have 7 magnification, and then the 50 would refer to the diameter in millimeters of
That's
the
right,
lenses?
of the front lens.
I see. Now, these are not 7 by 50s. They're larger
No.
than that.
These are what are known as giant binoculars.
Yes.
And this particular pair is an 11 by 80, and it's really about the largest binocular you can hold in your hand and still get a steady view. But most of these giant binoculars come attached with a tripod adapter, so you can hook them up to a large camera tripod and get a very steady view that way. And that way the stars don't shake around when you look at them.
Well, I'll hesitate to ask you about the cost of giants like these, but let me ask you about a good pair of 7 by 50 binoculars as a starter. What would you expect to pay for something like that?
For a good pair of 7 by 50s, you could expect to pay between $100 and $200 and get good optical quality.
I see. And maybe I will ask the question now, what would something like these, how much would they run?
Well, a good pair of giant binoculars you can expect to pay between $400 and $500 quite easily.
I see. Now finally, we'll go to this rather small-looking telescope, but a fairly impressive one that we have here on the table. John, is this what we call a compound telescope?
That's exactly what that is, Michael. The design of a compound allows for a greater focal length in a much shorter package. This particular one has a focal length of 1,000 millimeters, and that would compare with approximately 900 for the red one behind me. So if this was a reflector similar to that one, it would be about, I'd say, at least 5 or 6 times as long as it is. But because of the design, they're able to put into a very small package, and the factor of portability that I mentioned to you before, this is a very popular one from that aspect.
Well, now, what is the aperture or size of the lens at the front?
That particular one is 4 inches, and there's one manufacturer making a 6-inch one, and they 8 and 10, 11, 14 inches. The design is very popular, and it's available in a multitude of sizes. This is about the smallest.
This particular kind of instrument is going to cost a little bit more.
Yes, a little. They start at around $800, but they can easily go up into the $1,200 or $1,400, depending on the accessories that come with it and some special coatings that are available for the optics that increase light transmission and therefore give a brighter image. There's quite a wide range of prices for this one.
I see. Now finally, let's go to the last slide that we have here, and it is a photograph of two of the telescopes similar to one of the ones that Terry Dickinson showed us earlier. The one, Terry's telescope, is the one on the right. It's a 10-inch aperture, and the one on the left is an 8-inch aperture. John, what's the approximate cost of those telescopes?
The smaller of the two, being the 8-inch one, fully assembled on a tripod. This is the type of instrument that you really do have to look at a complete system, not just buying the telescope, but also a proper mounting for it, would run approximately $3,000. The larger 10-inch aperture one would be about $5,000.
I see. A lot of money.
Yes.
Are they good performers?
Yes, they're excellent.
All right.
Yeah, they're very versatile. There's a tremendous range of accessories available for them, and because it's so popular, any accessory that's being manufactured, the people manufacturing them always make sure that there's a version that will fit that particular telescope.
I see. Clive, I want to ask you this. For someone who is interested in buying a telescope or a pair of binoculars as a gift, what do you tell someone like that?
Well, you really have to be very careful if you're buying a gift for somebody in the way of a telescope. You usually have to ask the person to get the best idea, because you can easily make the wrong purchase. If you end up getting too small a telescope as a gift, it's just incapable of showing enough detail, and you can frustrate the person who's getting the gift.
John, is there any solution to that then?
It's hard enough picking one for yourself, Michael, let alone trying to pick one for someone else. It's not the ideal solution. I would recommend they perhaps buy a gift certificate where the individual could then come in after Christmas and participate in the selection of his or her own telescope.
Well, that makes sense. And for those of you who are interested then in buying telescopes as a gift, or in buying telescopes perhaps for yourself, go to any of Toronto's telescope supply shops, and I'm sure if you go to the Scope Shop or Perceptor, Clive Gibbons or John Kidner will be interested in helping you and in pointing out various kinds of telescopes. So we've come to the end of our program for today. Watch again next month for Astronomy Toronto. My name is Michael Watson. Thank you for watching.